Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video we're going to be doing another player ranking for season of Survivor I've done a review of, and that will be Survivor UK 2023. Obviously a player ranking here that is very, very late. However, we're finally getting around to doing it, and we have 18 players from this season to be ranking here. I'll be ranking them based on how I feel like they played on this actual season. With that, let's start off at number 18, the person I think played the worst on this season. Even though, to be honest, I feel like the bottom place people on this list are actually not entirely that bad. But at number 18, I do have Sabrina. And Sabrina is someone that, again, I think despite her being the first boot from her tribe, I don't feel like she's someone that's actually that bad. And she's someone that had allies in the game, and she had almost half the tribe wanting to keep her around. She had the likes of Hannah, Pegleg, and Lee in her group, a group that supposedly agreed enough to split the vote. Which, I mean, again, even then, the idea to split the vote doesn't really make much sense considering how did she think she had the numbers to do that. But still, I mean, she had almost half the tribe on her side. That's something. Now, obviously, a major issue is the fact that I do think personality-wise, she obviously very much turned away the likes of Rach and came off very abrasive and was someone just kind of annoyed people, to where that's still an issue here. But at the end of the day, I mean, considering she's at the very bottom of this list, again, I don't think she's entirely that bad. I feel like she, again, is someone that gets taken out despite having a good chunk of allies. There's at least some merit to her game, so because for me, she's here at number 18. Now, number 17, we're moving on to another player that was the first boot out of the tribe, the first boot of the season. We do have Richard. And again, I debate between Richard and Sabrina. Obviously, the big difference between the two that I think you would lean towards Sabrina is the fact that Sabrina had allies at the time she was voted out, while Richard didn't. However, I personally put less fault in Richard's boot on him than I do with Sabrina. Where I feel like with Sabrina, I think a lot of it is simply just due to her personality and her actual failings at the challenge. So where I feel like Richard gets taken out seemingly due to some irrational thinking about what happened at the challenge, where again a lot of the talk is that he cost Calaton the loss because he dropped the barrel, which again is kind of a dumb way of looking at the challenge, when again the likes of Leilani and Rachel failed the tribe even more in that challenge. Though at the same time, I mean, it is still obviously a failing on him to not convince the tribe of that. However, I will give him a little bit of credit in the fact that he seemed to have a really good relationship with Tanik, and again, considering the fact that Tanik ends up running the tribe, I do think that's something I'll give him some credit for, even though at the end of the day, obviously she didn't go out of her way to fight for him. But really, again, I just feel like his boot is just a very kind of fluky one. I don't feel like he does much actively wrong there. I mean, to be fair, I mean, from what we've heard from Express, he was playing the game pretty hard. That seemed to also put a target on his back. But at least in terms of what we're seeing on the show, I don't feel like anything we saw there was particularly bad. So again, for me, he's here at number 17. And number 16, moving on to the next person in the boot order. And here we do have Rach. And Rach is interesting in the fact that she obviously got her way in the first tribal. She did get Sabrina out of the game, was seemingly in a majority alliance, only for the majority alliance to seemingly crumble immediately following that, where she becomes the target of a split and gets taken out. Seemingly, I mean, based on exit press, due to the fact that she was looking for an idol and got caught. But Rach, again, I don't feel like does much actively wrong here. I mean, she seems to be someone that's even considered to be taken out just because she's a woman, and Lee doesn't like women. Really, I mean, Rach, outside that, again, had a really strong bond with Ashley and Chris, who ended up holding a lot of power following this tribal. And while I do think, again, it's fully on her, the fact that she was voted out over Ash, I do feel like, again, in comparison to many people that would typically be this low on the list, I don't feel like she actually does that much wrong, or it just feels like she was put in really bad circumstances, which is why I do still have her at number 16. And number 15, we're moving on to a similar style of player, one that, well, again, there's definitely blame to be had with their boot. I do feel like they still didn't do that much actively wrong, and that person is Rachel. And again, Rachel is someone that also seemingly gets voted out simply just due to challenge strength. It seems like that she gets voted out because of this notion that they need to keep Shai around, so that out of Jess and Rachel, they're going to vote out Rachel. And again, to be fair, Rachel does have failings there, and the fact that, again, they decided to keep Jess around over Rachel, clearly showing that Jess had a much better social game in the game and was better positioned in the game than Rachel was. But I mean, at the end of the day, again, her position is essentially the same as Rach's, except for the fact that she survives more tribals. She does go to 3 tribals tribals instead of Rach's 2. She also is taken out in more of a blind side here, to where she had someone like Jess who was undyingly loyal to her, and through that had to be blindsided in that way. So again, I think that's at least something in comparison to Rach, who had the entire tribe in on a plan to split the vote on her. So again, I think at the end of the day, like Rach and Rachel's games are pretty similar in how they play out. Though considering Rachel made it further, I will give her a little bit more credit here, and that's why she's here number 15. Now, number 14, we're moving on to the next person on the boot order, because that's how this list played out to begin with. Straight up, this list will become a bit more hectic following this, but at number 14, here we do have Ren. And Ren is an interesting player. I mean, as I talked about in my review, I do feel like Ren is a player that had a lot going on in their mind, where they were obviously worried about the future of Survivor UK, and I think through that made some decisions that didn't fully make sense game-wise, though they wanted to make sure that the show was on this specific path that I think did end up affecting their games. Again, the decision to take the idol clue is something that ended up being extremely detrimental to their game, though again, it felt like that was a decision that they made under that mantra. Now, again, probably would have made that decision anyway, but still, I do think it's like at least interesting context to be added to that, to where I think it makes that decision make a lot more sense in a position where, again, that is essentially the decision that cost them the game and allows for them to be the social pariah following this. Though, again, it did seem like they played pretty well at the beginning. I mean, they were in the middle of the game alongside Doug and were essentially the swings during the first couple votes. It was protected in the game due to the fact that they had this really good relationship with Doug. And again, all that is pretty good. Obviously, Doug ends up abandoning them and they get taken out after a swap, which is not particularly great. Again, taken out by their own allies who flipped the vote on them, which is, again, not particularly good. But I did think, considering how decently they were playing at the very beginning, and again, how there at least is rationale from outside the game of why they decided to make the decision that cost them the game, for me, it is enough to put them here at number 14. Now, number 13, we're jumping over a person here to a player that I find very tough to assess, as there's so much bad in this person's game, but also some pretty good stuff towards the end, even though obviously didn't survive it, and that person is Shai. And again, Shai is such an interesting player here in the sense that he is this massive super fan of the show. He was someone that tried to play the game very hard and seemingly was demonized for that at the very beginning, which caused him to be at the bottom of his tribe, which is obviously bad, though was then kept around simply due to challenge strength, because they felt like they needed him for challenges, and that caused them to vote out most of the women of their tribe. So again, his game up to the swap is pretty bad. It's simply him kind of lucking out just due to the fact that he's particularly good at challenges. Though, following the swap, I do think he actually plays it pretty well. I mean, while again, it doesn't work to his favor, seemingly just due to the fact that there was just very anti-Shai sentiment throughout the entire island due to the fact that he was playing the game at the beginning, which again, like leads to the likes of Doug and Peg like coming into the swap talking about wanting to target Shai. Despite that, again, he's able to turn them around for the first vote. He's able to get them to flip against Jess and take Jess out. And while obviously they do flip back the following vote and take him out, I do think he had the right idea strategically. Again, his plan of flipping against the Calaton, which he was on the bottom of, and working alongside Doug and Pegleg to try to play the middle, coming into the merge. Again, I do think that is the optimal plan for him, and I think he came extremely close to making that happen. Again, had he only been able to maintain the loyalty of Doug and Pegleg, which again, I feel like he didn't, simply because of how poorly received he was throughout the season, where again, you had Leilani going to the other tribe and continuously demonizing Shai, which I do think definitely played a factor into people's perceptions of Shai. So again, I do think Shai obviously has stuff wrong. I mean, yeah, he does become the social outcast from the very beginning, and who seemingly plays the game in a way that most people didn't respect. I mean, like, I don't expect Shai to have been able to win the game had he gotten to the end, but I still think at the points where he was actually able to play the game, he actually played the game pretty optimally. So again, for me, I do think there's enough good in Shai's game for him to be here number 13. Now, number 12, we're moving on to our first post-merge boot, and here we're actually having the merge boot itself, and here we do have Lee. And Lee is another one that is so tough to assess, because I think there is a lot bad with Lee. I mean, the fact that he is so abrasive in the game that causes him to get into many arguments, the fact that he never voted correctly in his entire Survivor career, which is pretty insane. Though, to be fair, some that were due to split votes. I mean, one of them in particular was the Rach vote, where, again, he actually wanted Rach out. However, he did vote for Ash as part of the split. But beyond that, again, like, it was on the outs during the Sabrina vote. He was in on the Ren vote, though voted for Leilani because that's Lee for you. But then obviously was on the outs during his eventual vote off. Again, it's a rocky game still. I mean, while he was in the no for half of those votes, he still had this very Borneo style of play of him just voting for who he think didn't deserve it the most. And just in general, obviously that is a major aspect of Lee's play, is this philosophy that he has that you need to keep around challenge strength and keep around the men because they're better at challenges. And again, all this is not particularly good play. Now, as I mentioned in my review, I do feel like it can be. I mean, like we saw in Australian Survivor Blood versus Water, where this can be an effective play for like the likes of Mark and Josh to be keeping around these bigger guys that they're not all picked off post-merge. But again, like that's not what Lee is doing here. Instead, he's like openly demonizing the women for not doing well in challenges, which just causes the women to want to rally together to take him out, to where there ended up being this very pro-women sentiment on this season, seemingly because of Lee's actions on the season. And again, if Lee had been doing this a bit more strategically, I do feel like I could at least like give him some credit for what he was doing. The problem is I don't feel like he was. I feel like he truly believes that the men were better in challenges. They need to keep all the men around because of that. And again, his eventual boot is pretty much solely based around that mantra, where it does feel like that's a large reason why the likes of Ash and Chris end up flipping. With Ash having been against Lee the entire time and through that had built this relation with Leilani and Tanik to take him out, alongside Chris, who he obviously got in an argument with. Again, it feels like Lee is 100% at fault for his eventual elimination, but he was technically in a good position on his original tribe. It doesn't seem like he was ever actually in danger and actually did lead the Rach vote, even though he wasn't the person that ended up voting for Rach. So again, like there's enough there to where for me, he's enough to put him at 12, despite the fact that I think he actually played a pretty terrible game. Now number 11, and now we're jumping forward a lot to where we're going from the merge boot all the way to a finalist. And here we do have Leilani. And I think Leilani played a pretty terrible game here. I mean, Leilani is a player that, again, was booted in the 4th round. Had she not been saved by the non-elimination twist there, she would have been gone. And she was literally almost the 4th boot of the season. However, ends up surviving that. And even despite that, is still kind of a target following that, where we still have the likes of Lee talking about how he wants to get rid of Leilani constantly throughout the pre-merge. And I do think Leilani would have been the easy boot had they gone to tribal immediately following that, though they just don't. And after the swap, we have, again, her recovering pretty well, where alongside Tanik and Matthew, they obviously end up working alongside Chris and Ashley and blindside Ren. And again, like that is decent work. The problem is how much of that was actual work for Leilani. And really, I think that's really the thing, is that Leilani following that is technically in the majority alliance. However, I feel like she has almost nothing to do with that majority alliance. She's simply just there, while the others are shown doing more active work. And she also has this like very Survivor Borneo-esque style of play of wanting to just vote for the people that deserve it and being really indignant over anyone that's trying to play the game strategically. And through that, again, like in the middle portion of the game, after Tanuki gets voted out, I mean, she's essentially on the outs for rounds. Following that is kind of kept around just due to the fact that she's not really much of a threat. Though I will say, I do think at the very, very end, from Final 5 on, I feel like she actually does pick up her game a bit. Not in the fact that she actually gained any real traction in the game, but at least she actually started to play actively. At least she finally started to take out these people who she perceived to be her threats in the game, and Pegleg and Hannah. The problem is that obviously it was just too late. She couldn't beat anybody. I do like the fact that she at least tried at the very end of the game. So again, at least that's something. Even through that, she still has like massive misreads on Matthew's jury chances. And really just in general, like I do feel like she's a pretty terrible runner-up here. I think probably one of the worst runner-ups of all time. Largely due to the fact that, again, she was voted on, came back, and even outside that, really had nothing truly propping up her game. Again, in comparison to the people we already talked about, obviously she has longevity over those people. She made it all the way to the end. She survived more rounds. However, she's still this low because, again, like even despite that, she didn't play particularly well. So because of that, for me, she's here at number 11. Now, number 10, we're moving on to the last pre-juror on the board, and here we do have Jess. And Jess was a bit of a tough player to assess in the fact that I actually feel like Jess didn't play entirely bad. Now, I think there is some bad in the fact that she does not vote with the majority at points. I mean, she does vote for Shai over Richard. Though, to be fair, that was a position where she knew Richard was going. She just wanted to vote for Shai despite that, which, I mean, questionable move in itself. She just voted out Leilani. That's something. But then she's obviously blindsided the Rachel vote and then blindsided herself the next time she goes to tribal. So, like, on a pure voting record perspective, it's not particularly good. She also does have this, like, mantra of wanting to only keep around the people that she gets along with. And again, it does feel like a bit of a rudimentary way of looking at the game, though at the same time, I think Jess ended up being a really good social player, where it seemed like people love Jess out there, to where, again, she's kept around over Rachel, seemingly due to her connections to Tanik, Matthew, and Nathan. She is someone that is never really talked about as someone to be taken out due to being a physical liability. She's probably someone on par with the likes of a Rachel, and the fact that, like, after the Rachel vote, the likes of Nathan, Tanik, and Matthew are probably going to stick to Jess. Again, I think that is pretty good. Where in a way, I could see you say that she's swap screwed, though again, I think she had opportunities to save herself and just didn't take them. But still, obviously, like a situation, she still ends up being somewhat unfortunate in the fact that Matthew and Tanik end up swapping to the other tribe, to where, and Jess is not a particularly good player in the grand scheme of things, so I think her game on this season is not actually that bad, with her having a good chunk of allies on her side, though again, seems to very rarely be able to use those to actually truly benefit her game. But still someone that I think would have been in a much better position had she not been taken out at that one specific point in the game, where I think she probably had a deep run in her, to where, because that, for me, I do have her here number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to a player that has a rocky game, though I think there are definitely points where they pull off some pretty impressive plays, even though I think you can very much question the quality of those plays. But either way, at number 9, I do have Ashley. And Ashley's a player that I do think ends up being one of the players that was seemingly ahead of her time. I mean, someone that had a more grounded, strategic outlook on the game, and through that, again, has some pretty impressive aspects to her game. And she is part of the majority that flips the vote onto Sabrina, despite the fact that she was the target in that round. Seemingly organizes the votes against Ren, which, I mean, you can qualm with. Where, again, like, should she have been taking out Ren in that spot? Probably not, but she still does organize the votes there, and seemingly pulls over Tanik and Leilani, which also allows her to really organize the Lee vote as well, which is another vote that, again, should she have done? Maybe not. I think that one's a bit more debatable, though. Obviously, her entire game blows up the following round, where Lee ends up leaking information that causes her to lose trust with Tanik and Leilani, and through that, ends up being on the bottom alongside Chris. But even then, like, technically gets idled out of the game. I mean, she was extremely close to staying, and had she stayed, I think she could have had an interesting run moving forward. Now, I don't know if she would have been the challenge beast that Christopher would have been, though, to be fair, I still probably would have expected her to be a, like, mid-merge boot, but still someone that, again, like, I think definitely had potential in the game. I mean, she seemed to definitely get the strategy of the game and play the game strategically. She, again, made these moves of flipping against her own group, though, again, I do question if those were the moves to make, where, yeah, I do feel like she makes those moves in positions where she's not seeming to really take into account the after effects of those moves. And to be fair, I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that she fully thought she had Leilani and Tanik on her side, which, I mean, to be fair, I mean, it seems like she kind of did at the beginning at least. Though obviously they don't end up sticking true to her by the end, but still, I do think at the end of the day that Ashley is a game that has some good, has some bad. I mean, even a lot of the more actively bad portions of her game are bad because of this more misogynistic outlook on the game that was very prominent earlier on, where, and she's able to overcome that and make some moves, though again, not really moves that really benefit her much in the game, which is why I do struggle with where to land her, but I did end up going with number 9 here. Now, number 8, we're moving on to a player that I don't think this person is a particularly good player. Like, I think in comparison to Ashley, I think Ashley is a better player than this person we're about to be talking about. However, I think when we're talking about their game, I think there's at least, like, more things to point out, and that person is Lawrence. And again, straight up Lawrence, I do not think is that good at the game. I mean, the fact that he essentially does the coach move during the Tanik vote and expects to get away with it is really dumb. I don't think he really had the greatest strategic mind in the world. Though, again, I do think there are some decent aspects to Lawrence's game. I think particularly the post-swap. Again, like I said with Shai, I do think he does play that pretty well. I do think his optimal move there is to flip over and try to work with Doug and Pegleg. And while it doesn't work out, I do still feel like he does play that well initially. And I do like the fact that he actively was using Shai as a shield in the game. So again, I think all that is really good. Problem is, I do think most of his game outside that is kind of lackluster, to where earlier on he is voting with the other Caltons, so it's again kind of left out of the majority group. And in the post-merge, he also is once again, like, kind of just being lumped in with Calaton just because he's from Calaton, but not really being actually involved in that group in any significant way, where it really feels like he's just empowering a power structure that he's not benefited by. And to be fair, I mean, when the Tanik vote happens, he allows it to happen, and Tanik going out in that spot is probably beneficial to his game. The problem is that he didn't really maintain many relationships outside that, to where, despite making that move, he's still pretty much a consensus target for the following round, where, while, yeah, you can argue that he gets screwed over by Nathan having the idol, which was obviously a very luck-dependent situation for Nathan, it still felt like he was a very exposable number in the game, and one that would have just easily been taken out whenever they felt like it. And Lawrence is someone that I don't feel like had much traction in the game. I also feel like jury-wise, I don't feel like they would respect the way that he played the game. So again, I do struggle with Lawrence's overall win potential, and obviously some individual moves he made, or the Tanuki move in particular being really, really bad, to where it's definitely a mixed bag of a game, but one that, again, is enough for me to land here, number 8. Now number 7, and now we're moving on to a player that made it very deep into the season and definitely could have potentially won the season. I think this person definitely had win equity at the end. However, I don't think they played particularly well despite that. And that person is Hannah. And again, Hannah was the 4th place finisher on this season, was someone that, had she been able to make it the final tribal, I think she probably wins the game. I think it's a very close vote, truth be told, but I think it is one that is leaning towards Hannah. So again, because of that, you might question why she had number 7 here, and it's because, again, I don't think she played particularly well despite that. I think she really lucked out in even getting to that spot in the game, where, I mean, like, looking at her early game, I mean, despite the fact that, again, she was protected by Lee, again, she very rarely votes in the majority. I'm outside the Rach vote, she's simply on the outs of almost every other vote, at least until the Ashley vote off, where, again, she's on the outs during the Sabrina vote, or she's targeting Ashley there, she targets Ashley in the Ren vote, only for Ren to go home, she then targets Ashley again at the Lee vote, only for Lee to go home. Even the one vote that she was in the majority on, getting Rach out, that was a situation where she wanted to get rid of Ashley. So again, like, all that is particularly bad. Now again, she's involved in getting Ashley, which in itself, yeah, she succeeds in finally getting her way, but also it's bad for her game. Again, she's really weakening the Lenena numbers at that point to where she should have been screwed. As we later see Doug get taken out, and again, I think she gets very, very fortunate in the fact that Chris and Matthew are able to flip the game against Tanuki, to where I really give Hannah very little credit for that. Even though I do think, again, she does flip against Tanuki, that's something that at least to give her some credit for, but really I feel like she was one of the least involved in actually making that flip happen. And I find that, again, like, she's back in the majority, but even then, like, I think she makes a pretty bad move in getting rid of Pegleg at 5, even getting rid of Nathan over likes of Chris and Matthew, I think you could argue. But again, it feels like she just played a very short-sighted game to where, again, there's almost no way she was actually gonna make it to the final 3 unless she had one final immunity at the final 4, where, like, at the end of the day, it's like, how much could she have really saved Pegleg anyway? But she still actively wanted Pegleg out, which is really bad. So, like, I don't feel like Hannah played a particularly good game. I feel like she really lucked her way into a position where she could have potentially won the game by the time of the final 4, but even then, she would have barely won. I mean, and if we're talking about her final 3 scenario that she wanted to go to the end with, of her, Chris, and Matthew, I still think Matthew gets the votes of, like, Nathan and Lawrence and probably even Doug in that position. Again, Chris probably still gets Ashley, where Hannah probably gets Lee, Pegleg, and Tanuki, where I do think Leilani is the swing. And again, I think she probably leans Hannah, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility of her voting Matthew as well. Though, again, like, I just feel like her win scenarios weren't even that large to where really I feel like her game is just not that particularly good, and because of that, for me, she's here number 7. Now number 6, we're moving on to a player that I think is just a step above Hannah. Even though this person was taken out by Hannah, this person at least had more win equity in my mind than Hannah, and that person is Pegleg. And again, Hannah and Pegleg's games are not that dissimilar. I mean, I think their games are very similar early on, the fact that they are kind of attached to Lee, and through that, again, are on the outs during the Sabrina vote, though then are on the end during the Rach vote. However, I think something to really prop his game up is I think he's playing better post-swap. Again, he is able to have the likes of Shai and Lawrence flip to them, and then they flip back on them, which, again, the plan to flip back on them, questionable move, but still, I mean, like, was in the majority entire post-swap phase of the game, and then following that, again, is on the same rocky path as Hannah, where, again, they're essentially working together the entire time. They were, again, out on the Lee vote, in on the Ashley vote, which, again, is really bad for their games, out on the Doug vote, in on the Tanuki vote, and again, I think you can call him the Nathan vote as well, and then eventually he's just taken out unanimously because they look at him as the biggest jury threat on the board. Again, I don't think it's a particularly good game in terms of how he navigated through the game, but again, I do think in terms of win equity, if he were to somehow win the final 2 immunity challenges, I think he probably wins the game, where I think if we talk about the exact same scenario that I talked about with Hannah, but just swapping her out for Pegleg, I do think Pegleg picks up Doug's vote in that situation, and while at that point I think Tanuki's vote is a little bit more unsure, I do think Nathan is probably at least somewhat likely to also vote for Pegleg, to where, and I think Pegleg definitely has better odds in that situation, to where, again, it's really that, along the fact that he played better during the swap phase of the game, that, again, for me, leaves Pegleg here, number 6. Now, number 5, we're moving on to a player that I'm not entirely sure this person's win equity at the end, though I do think their navigation through the game, while again, somewhat frustrating at points due to his heavy reliance on loyalty, I do feel like still played a pretty strong game, and that person is Nathan. And again, Nathan is someone that was essentially running the original Calaton tribe. I mean, while it obviously gets talked about as it's him and Tanuki running OG Calaton, really, we do see Nathan getting more of his way at points. Again, we see him get Richard out of the game, something he wanted way more than Tanik did. We see him getting Leilani out in a position where, again, Tanik wanted to save Leilani and take out Shai. So it does feel like Nathan was the one that was really running the early portion of the game. However, I do think he obviously has a streak of overconfidence to where he's completely blindsided by the Jess vote and then kind of gets lucked out the following vote, where it doesn't even seem like he puts that much good work into pulling over Doug and Pegleg. It just feels like they flip over just due to the fact that they didn't particularly like Shai. But again, the fact that he survives that round is very impressive. And following that, again, he's able to get back with his Calotons and they run the early portion of the merge to where they're eventually blindsided by Matthew flipping on them. And really from that point on, it's not a particularly good game. I mean, he gets saved at the final 7 simply just due to the idol, and even then doesn't really make much use out of it. And is obviously taken out at 6 in a spot where, again, I think you could definitely qualm with the decision to take him out there for the main decision makers there, to where, yeah, I mean, like, does he play a particularly good game after that? Not really, but I do think his, again, early game, I think is very, very strong. I think he really dominated the original Calaton tribe, and I do think early post-merge is pretty strong as well, to where, and like at the end of the day, I do think in comparison to the likes of Pegleg and Hano, who I think had very little control over most of the season, I feel like Nathan at least had more control and had less suboptimal play, which is enough for me to put him here at number 5. Now, number 4, and now we're going to someone that was booted way earlier on this season, someone that I think has a lot of holes in their game, but at number 4, I am going to go with Doug. And Doug is someone that, again, I think was playing extremely well for the first half of the season. I think coming into the Shai vote, I think he was playing a near perfect game of Survivor. I think he was playing the middle in his original tribe, but was very well positioned socially to where both sides really wanted to work with him. He obviously takes out Sabrina, was able to instantly flip back and really take none of the brunt of the blame for that vote and then vote out Rach. And is again perfectly positioned in the middle coming into swap while also having an idol in his pocket. Though again, he does swap, and his swap is not particularly good position for him. One that has him also leaking the fact that he found the idol of the Pegleg, which just felt like an unnecessary move there. Still not a completely detrimental one, where again, they're able to flip over Shai and Lawrence, and that really ends up putting them in the power position the following round, where again, like, I do qualm the decision to keep Nathan. I do think that's one that I would personally disagree with. I do think Shai was definitely a bigger asset to their game following that, where really keeping Nathan just empowered this Calaton power structure that really ends up causing the end of Doug's game following that. As again, I think following that, Doug's game is really sloppy. I think the fact that he, again, like, fails to save Lee in a position where he should have had the social capital to be able to do so. And even beyond that, and again, his attuning targeting of Chris and Ashley following that is just really asinine. And I feel like his eventual boot is purely on him. I'm simply just not utilizing his social capital really at any point in the game outside of just keeping him safe for a short term. But it feels like he, again, like, just really drops the ball in those final few days to where it's tough to put him much higher on this list. Again, I do think his early game is very strong, where I think coming into the merge, he probably had played the best game of the season up to that point, but really the back half of his game is really sloppy in my mind, where again, I feel like it's tough to really place him much higher here than number 4. Now, number 3, we're moving on to a person that I did debate a bit here. I do think 2 and 3 are relatively close. Obviously, there's a massive placement difference between the two. However, at number 3, I am going to go Tanik. And Tanik is a player that, obviously, when we talk about Tanik, we typically talk about her as like the person that was running the game, someone that was poised to really just dominate the game and win the game had she not taken out at 8. And I do still stand by that. I do think if she was not taken out at 8, I do think there's a very good likelihood that she just really steamrolls the rest of the game, gets to the end against the likes of like Nathan and Matthew and probably beats them, and probably would beat almost anybody in a jury vote at that point. However, I do think her game up to that point is something that you could definitely qualm with. And while position wise she was very strong, I do actually disagree with some decisions she makes. Now, early on, again, like, I do think Nathan gets his way over Tanik, where Tanik wants, again, to keep around Richard, keep around Leilani, yet they vote them out despite that. I think her decision to swap was pretty misguided. It puts her in a lot of danger there, where had the original Lenena had their ducks in order, she would have been booted in that spot. Where Chris literally tried to throw the challenge to vote Tanik out. And when we get to the merge, I mean, yeah, she's like leading the charge in these early votes. And while I do think just outright getting rid of Lee is obviously beneficial to her game, I think getting rid of Ash is not as beneficial to her game. So while obviously, yeah, there was not much she could do with Chris playing the idol, I do think the fact that she even like had Ashley as a backup there is pretty misguided. That even if Ashley had survived that round, again, Ashley's probably more likely to work with you than she is with the original Lenenas. And it also would have been a massive target in front of you. And And again, her getting rid of Doug as well, same thing, like a massive target in front of her. And when I think through making that move, she ends up alerting the likes of Pegleg and Hannah to the game that she's playing, which makes her an easy target the following round, where I don't think she plays particularly well at points in the game. I think she makes decisions that I would not necessarily agree with. And at the end of the day, ultimately fails at keeping Matthew in line, which I think is the biggest detrimental aspect of her game. So again, I think in terms of her navigation through the game, I'm a bit mixed on her game, even though, again, I think she completely had the potential to run the table following her boot round. And even then, again, like had been in this power position for a lot of the game. But I just don't feel like she really did that well in that power position, considering I do disagree with some decisions she made, to where, again, it's still a very, very strong game. But I feel like for me, that is the reason why I'm leaving here at number 3. Now, number 2. And at number 2, we have a person that, again, I don't think this person played the greatest game in the world. I was actually kind of surprised at just how much shock there was at this person not winning the game. But at number 2, I'm going to go Christopher. And again, Christopher was the runner-up this season. And in comparison to Tanik, I do feel like that's a major reason why he's higher here. Is he's, again, like Chris's game for me is not particularly great, but he did make it all the way to Final 2 in a situation where, while he doesn't win, I do feel like there are potential routes for him to get a good chunk of votes had he not been in the end game with Matthew, who I think kind of sniped a lot of votes away from him. But I mean, like, really outside that, I don't think Chris played that great of a game. I mean, really for me, I think the person that I would relate Chris to the most is someone like a Mike Holloway, just without the win equity, which is pretty bad. But I think he's someone that, again, like early on seemed to be in a decent position. Not that he was running his original tribe the way that Mike Holloway was, where, again, it did very much feel like he kind of catered to the likes of Lee and Doug and like taking out Rach in the 3rd round, where, well, again, yeah, he organized the votes against Sabrina and would later organize the votes against Ren and was decently positioned up to that point. I do feel like at the end of the day, I don't feel like he was really running the tribe. And I think really at that point, that's where his game blows up following that, where he tries to throw the challenge. I think it feels like through that, his tribe loses trust with him. The other tribe also loses trust with him. For it feels like at that point, people just looked at him as this massive snake in the game and didn't really want anything to do with him, to where he comes to the merge in this rocky position, but again, is still able to get Lee out, only being targeted the following round and gets saved by an idle play. He then gets saved due to something completely out of control when Doug goes home, to where, again, I do think he's actually trying to do the optimal move at that point, trying to gain the Calaton. Obviously, he's just very ineffective in doing so. He then follows that up by essentially needing the next few immunity challenge win. Now, again, I do think he does some good work in taking out Tanik. I think that is a position where I would give him a lot of credit for that flip, to where, well, again, I think you could give some credit to Hannah and Pegleg for getting in Matthew's head that he won't win if he gets to the end with Tanik. I do feel like a lot of the groundwork and a lot of the urgency of making that move was due to how good Chris's relationship was with Matthew. So again, I will give Chris a lot of credit for that move. But following that, again, like he's in this position where he's probably out if he doesn't win the next few immunity challenges. And while he, again, does have a very good relationship with Matthew, I don't know if that would have been enough to really get him through those next few rounds. And really, it feels like by the end of it, he was kind of just dragged to the end as a goat, where people just recognized the fact that he wouldn't win the game and through that wanted to take him to the end. So again, it's not a particularly great game, but really I think in comparison to the people we've already talked about, again, considering he made it all the way to the end of the game, in a position where I do think he was definitely one of the most strategically minded players of the season. I mean, even in the spots where he's not in a good position in the game, I do think he is playing somewhat optimally. Again, I do think he is making the right calls for his game and trying to get the Lenenas back together. Again, being a major reason why the vote against Tanik ends up happening. I do feel like he maintains this really good relationship with Matthew, and again, is able to get Nathan out, and again, is able to get the two biggest jury threats out before the end, and Hannah and Pegleg. Now, I do think there's some debate to be had that maybe he should have gotten rid of Matthew along the way, to have him obviously gain Matthew's jury vote, and also having him be kind of the sole representation of someone that played the game in this strategic way, where I think in that light, he maybe could have gotten the likes of a Doug, maybe even a Lawrence, but really, I do feel like his winning chances were not particularly high. And considering, again, the sloppiness of his game, it is kind of tough to really even justify putting him at 2 here, but I do think considering he made it all the way to the end and having a lot of agency along the way, for me, it was enough to put him at number 2. And now number 1, I mean, number 1's not even close for me. This is like number 1 by a lot, and I'm actually shocked at the reaction to his win, considering I feel like this was just a foregone conclusion of how much better of a game he played, but that person is Matthew. And again, like Matthew to me plays the best game of the season by a lot. I mean, like it's not close. I mean, he was never really in danger throughout the entire season and had a lot of pull and a lot of really integral votes of the season, to where you could definitely call him earlier on that he is definitely one of the lesser seen players there. I mean, while he is in the Calaton majority, we don't really see him really leading the charge on votes, though to be fair, he does get his way. I mean, the way he talks about in confessional does eventually happen. I mean, he talks about getting rid of Rachel when Rachel goes. He talks about getting rid of Leilani over Shai when Leilani goes. Again, like he is getting his way earlier on. He does swap into a position where, again, despite the fact that he should be pretty easily taken out, again, he's never targeted there. I mean, it does seem like the likes of Lee and Chris do want to protect him in that position. So again, that's pretty good work there. Following the merge, again, he's alongside Calaton and taking out Lee, taking out Ash, again, wanting to keep Chris around, as again, he has a really good relationship with Chris and is maintaining him as a number. He leads the charge against Doug, again, something that I think is a pretty understated move for his game, and one that, again, doesn't really get highlighted on the show, though I think is very integral to his game, and keeping Chris around for one more round, again, an ally that's closer to him than most other people, while also getting rid of probably the biggest threat to his game, where he was the one that supposedly led the charge on that vote, and I think through that is a very impressive move there, and along the fact that he later flips against Tanik, which again is a move that you can argue was him being manipulated by Chris or by the other Lanenas, though again, I still think the fact that he was able to flip against Calaton in a season of Survivor UK where the level of strategy should not have been that high, for him to be the sole flipper, I think it's a pretty impressive move to be seen there. Again, him like going out of his way to make the move that he knows is beneficial to his game. And following that, again, like despite the fact that he makes this massive flip, he's still not targeted. I mean, well, again, there was talk about potentially putting votes on him after Nathan had found the idol. It never happens. And even then, Nathan, despite being upset at Matthew for flipping on him, still wants Lawrence out more than Matthew and votes for Lawrence there. While also Matthew, again, does very good work in changing the votes at the last second onto Lawrence. And to be fair, again, you would argue, obviously, the fact that he needed to do that because of his own mistake of not locking the cage and essentially handing Nathan the idol. But again, to me, that really has no merit on a Survivor game, where someone's ability to properly lock a cage doesn't mean much in terms of how I assess their game of Survivor. Or it's not like Matthew intentionally wanted to handle the idol to Nathan. That would have been truly bad. This is more so just an instance where he just accidentally did so through non-social means, which again, I don't really fault him that much for, especially considering he's able to recover from that adversity really well. And again, following that, again, he's able to take out Nathan and then is able to get his two biggest jury threats out at the very end of the game in Pegleg and Hannah. Now, again, you could definitely argue something to demerit him is the fact that, again, I don't know if he beats Hannah. I think that's very close. I think he probably just outright loses to Pegleg. Or again, you could definitely argue that his winning chances weren't as strong, but I do think he does a lot of good work to get himself into that final three. Sure, again, like I think in comparison to the rest of the people from his cast, it doesn't really change much for me. To where, again, if I eventually do my like global winner ranking, I mean, that'll definitely be a thing to mention there. But I think in terms of this list in particular, it doesn't really change much. I think at the end of the day, he is the best player of the season by a lot. He is a player that, again, was never in danger the entire season, was someone that organized some really integral votes along the way, and also still able to maintain people's jury votes through his really strong relationships with them. In a position where typically being the sole flipper burns you so much social capital in the game, he's still able to maintain those jury prospects, which is a very impressive aspect of his game as well. Where really for me, again, I think Matthew is by far the best player on this season, and I don't think it's particularly close, so because that for me, he is here number one. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for every player of Survivor UK 2023, a video that's obviously coming out in 2024, but whatever. And that finishes my coverage of Survivor UK. Now, obviously outside this, just stay tuned for more of the same content about most other seasons of Survivor that are coming up alongside the other shows that I typically cover. Obviously, just expect more of the same in this coming year, so obviously just expect more of the same coming up. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.